Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the session Data to Drops, Leveraging Water Points Data for Improved Decisions. That's going to be facilitated by Brian Banks. Before we start, I want to give you a little bit of logistic around the format of this webinar. So for just to make it easy, we won't unmute anybody apart from the presenters. Meaning that if you have any question, we ask you to use the chat box that's situated at the bottom of your window for this program. So just go into the chat box and ask any questions you may have during the presentation. I'll then have a look at your questions and ask them on your behalf so that Brian can answer them. And we will answer the questions at the end of the presentation to make things easier as well. Feel free to ask the question as they come, and they will be answered after the presentation. Also, for you to know, this presentation is going to be recorded, and you're going to receive a link to access the presentation later if you wish to go back to it. And just the last thing I have to mention is that CAWST isn't responsible for the content of the presentation as much as I've been in touch with Brian and we really support his presentation. I had to say that. So I'm now going to unmute Brian, and both of us are going to be sharing our webcam just for a few seconds to say hi to you. Brian, are you here? Hello, everybody. Hi, Brian. We can't hear you. Oh, let's see. I think you're still muted.
Can you hear me now? We
can. Perfect. Thank you.
Wonderful. So, well, good morning and good afternoon to everybody, and calling in here from the UNC Water and Health Conference. So it's been a day full of WASH. And so excited to be able to share with all of you kind of what we're working on and look forward to answering your questions and having this discussion.
Perfect. So I'm going to make you presenter so that you can share your presentation, and I'm going to mute myself. So we're going to cut your webcams as well. You can cut your webcam so that it's not on the way. And
great.
There you go.
All right. Are you able to see it okay?
Yes, it works. So I'm going to mute myself now so that you don't have any background noise.
Okay, perfect. That sounds perfect. I'm at the conference, so apologies for any background noise that sneaks in. I think we'll get right into it. We've been working on this water data issue for a while, trying to understand what's going on with water data, how can we do more with it. And what we found is that all over the world, water point mapping is fundamentally changing the landscape of the water sector. For the first time ever, we now know who did what, when, and where. More and more, we're getting information on whether water is flowing and even whether it's flowing over time. This data is powerful. It's powerfully transforming the way our sector works, from improving governance to aligning development partners to supporting emergency response and much more. Each one of us has probably seen cases where water point mapping has improved the lives of communities around the world. Today, we're going to talk about one major challenge that is limiting the impact of water point mapping and how we can work together to solve this challenge and improve the way water services are delivered. Maybe before we get there, let me just figure out, there we go. Before we get there, I just want to be really clear that this isn't our work. This isn't the work of Global Water Challenge alone. We've been doing it with a broad cross-section of the WASH sector. And you can see some of them here, everyone from governments to multilaterals, to universities, to NGOs, to donors, and kind of clear across the board. I mean, it's the work that I'll be presenting is really the work of this entire group. So when we started looking at this problem, the first thing we saw is that the real challenge we face is, let me just get this out of your way. The real challenge we face is a result of the way that water point mapping has been carried out in the past. Many, many different stakeholders have developed many different ways of water point mapping for a lot of different purposes. They develop different lists of questions, all asked slightly different ways, and then they use different tools to collect the information. Once the information is collected, it's then shared in vastly different ways, if it's shared at all. Well, the flexibility is really good because it allows people to really tailor their water point mapping solutions to meet their goals. It's also a huge problem for everybody. And what you can see here are all real examples of water point mapping: phone surveys, PDF reports, maps, images, graphs, charts, all of which are different ways people have tried to share their water point data. But it doesn't work out quite as well as we would hope. As I said, it's a huge problem for everybody. At the local level, decentralized governments often lack the resources they need to access the data. When they don't have the information, planning and providing services to their constituency becomes a major challenge. At a national level, governments might have data from many different stakeholders that don't fit together, or they might have a national inventory with no efficient way to update it. Without this, they're missing information they need to develop impactful and effective policies. We can then look at the regional level. At a regional level, the fragmentation of all of this data makes regional monitoring and evaluation and benchmarking nearly impossible. There is no way to identify who within the region is doing well and who needs more support. At a global level, we also see this huge problem. The SDGs call for strengthening coordination, equity, and affordability. Without a way to roll up water point data at a global level, we miss a great opportunity to complement the data that the JMP is collecting. Of course, there are the needs of NGOs, universities, and donors to consider as well. So how can we solve this challenge and make sure all of these different stakeholders have easy access to the information they need? The good news is that this hard work is already being done, increasingly so. The data that we need to understand water point information is already being collected more and more every year. The only missing piece is to put all of this data together in a way that's not burdensome or redundant to existing systems. So to start, we knew we needed a standard. We needed some common way to share water point data. And so the first thing we did is we looked at over 2,500 different attributes being collected all over the world. We looked at more than 70 water point monitoring frameworks from government, academia, and civil society, and started to understand what are people really looking at. We then grouped all of these different attributes by category based on what questions they asked. So if they were asking location, it didn't matter if they called it coordinates or latitude or x coordinate. They were all asking about where in space is this water point. So we grouped things together based on what question they answered, which category that was, whether it was things about location, status, type of infrastructure, etc. We were then curious, what are people really collecting out of these categories? Which of them are common? So we looked at what % of the data sets that we looked at were looking at location versus what % of them maybe were looking at color of the water point. And we got a frequency chart that looks like what you see here. We knew that the standard couldn't collect everything, and indeed shouldn't. It's not useful if only 2 organizations on the planet are collecting something. There's not a lot of value in sharing that information and comparing it together. What we really want to focus on is what most people were collecting. And so we established a threshold of 50%. So we wanted to focus on the data that at least 50% of organizations around the world were already collecting. That turned out to be a really important decision because it allowed us to look at historic data as well. So data that was collected long before the standard exists. We then compiled all of that into a draft standard and shared that for public release. More than 100 people around the world contributed to help shape what would become the final standard. And once that was done, we launched a final standard. And we say final, but it's not quite final. It's still continuing to evolve. And if you visit waterpointdata.org, you can see what the process is for updating that standard. And in fact, just last month, we added our first water quality attributes. So here you can see what those attributes are. And you'll have to forgive me, this doesn't include the new water quality attributes, which look at fecal coliform. but you can see that we require some information. Where is it? What is it? When was the data collected? And this becomes incredibly important because often we get different organizations that have monitored the same water point at different periods in time. So maybe the government monitored it in 2014, and maybe World Vision came through a few years later and monitored the same data. We need to know which came first so that we can show the change over time and we can understand what the latest status is. We'll also capture the data source. There's no way that we can go and visit the 350,000 or so water points in the Water Point Data Exchange repository. So we really need to trust the people that are sharing the data, and we want to do that transparently so that you as a user can decide, do you want to use the government's data? Do you want to use a specific NGO's data? Or do you feel like there might be reliability concerns there? So we're very transparent on where the data came from. We also have other fields that will add more color to the data. So we're looking at things like, when was it installed? What type of management structure is there? Are people currently paying for water? Who installed the water point? Even what is the condition? And even a link to a photograph. So that gets us part of the way there, but we want to make it as easy as possible. So how do we take all of this data that people are collecting in different templates and different formats and really make this data work for all of us? How can we leverage the data that's already been collected and add more value? And this is where the Water Point Data Exchange comes in. We use a very simple system of hashtags. So you can see this example here. Maybe in your organization, you call it location X or location Y when you collect it. And so we have standard hashtags, things like LawnDag or LatDag. And these 19 hashtags correspond to the attributes we just shared. And all you need to do to share your data is replace your headers with these hashtags and upload it. We've worked really hard to create a platform that can deal with this in the back end and make sense of that information, put it into the right categories, validate the data, harmonize it with what's already in the database. And all you need to do to make that work is swap in the right hashtags. That's it. If everyone in the sector did that, we could start to see real change throughout the sector. And what we're seeing is it's working. People are increasingly sharing data. We have about 38 countries with data available, and about 20% of those countries have more than one source. That means the data available on WPDx is more comprehensive than any single source that exists for that country. We have over 359,000 records, and the water points chronicle more than a century of wash investment. You can see on the map there the diversity: Asia, Africa, Latin America, and that continues to grow. But just having a big database isn't very useful. We wanted to make sure people could actually do things with it and learn from it. And this is what makes real change in the sector so simple. The system within WPDx can check the data, update any water points already in the system. So in the example before of a government collecting data and then World Vision collecting the same water point data later on, the system will actually put those together so we can see the change over time. And then we can serve up filterable data that can be used for analysis. You can even subscribe to get updates anytime data in a specific country changes. Of course, this is all totally free. But pie charts weren't getting us quite far enough. We knew that there was more that could be done, more ways to use this data to fundamentally improve the way that water services are being provided. And so we partnered with a group called APT. They're a MasterCard company. And they worked with us to go through the Water Point Data Exchange data to see what we could learn and how we can actually use the data that was already collected for other purposes to improve services. So we started out looking at things like validating the global SDG measurements, whereas the SDGs are monitored by the JMP by asking at household level, do they have services? We were able to do the inverse and say how many people live within a certain distance of a functional water point, and able to kind of cross-reference and triangulate what can we learn by looking at these SDG questions in a different way. We could also figure out where are the population centers where fixing water points can have the greatest impact. So out of all of the broken water points in a country, we could understand which water point should be prioritized for repair. In the case of Liberia, we found that if you fixed a strategic 100 water points using this process, rather than a random 100 water points, you could actually increase services for about 40,000 people. So we're talking about the same cost, repairing the same number of water points, and just doing it a bit more strategically and improving services for tens of thousands of people. We can even get more sophisticated than that using the data available, and we can start to develop predictive analytics where we can actually use this data to predict which water points are likely to last over time. And by doing that, we can actually understand which districts might have the greatest needs for operations and maintenance in the future, and we can plan budgets accordingly. So we can make sure that the really scarce resources that are available are being invested in the water points where they're most needed and the districts where we can most likely expect that there will be a great need. And so the question, of course, is if we can do all this, who's actually doing it? Who's using this? And you can see here it's a pretty diverse bunch. We have governments that are using the data, we have academia, private sector, and of course NGOs using it, perhaps more than anyone else. And this is huge. NGOs that are partnering with governments to deliver services are using this data to plan out how they can be more effective in the field. As I said at the beginning, this is a massive challenge, and that challenge really is fragmented data that limits the use and reach of the powerful information. But we also have a simple solution right in front of us. We can simply ensure that certain pieces of information are collected in a standardized way and then shared globally through the WaterPoint data exchange. At the end of the day, WPDx allows local governments to have the information they need at their fingertips. National governments can make policies with eyes wide open. Regional groups can even evaluate progress in the region, and WaterPoint mapping can play a role in supporting SDG monitoring. When we layer on NGOs that can work more effectively and research institutions that can learn more robust lessons, we really see the dots start to connect. And that is how we can transform this sector. So if anyone would like to get involved in sharing your data, accessing data, learning from data, it's all public, it's all freely available, it's easy to share, and you can do all of that at waterpointdata.org. If you have any questions at all, my email is there, and I would love to talk to you more about how you can be a part of this progress. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about this, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Brian. So for the participants, please use the chat box if you have any questions. So far, we don't have any, but if anybody
I answered all of them. That's perfect.
So it was very clear. Very good presentation. So we'll give you a few more minutes to ask your questions if you wish to. Here is a question from Joshua. Is there an open source best, the question escaped. Is there an open source best way to collect data?
So we're agnostic. Our role is really to, once organizations have collected data, however they choose to do it, to give them a place to share that data and make more value added to it. Of course, there's a couple of platforms that we work closely with. One is MWater, another is ACVO. Within both of those platforms, there's fairly simple ways to take the data that's been collected and share it to WPDx. And in some cases, we're looking at even being able to automate that in the future. So certainly ACVO and MWater come to mind. Other folks use EpiSurveyor or Magpie, OpenSDK. There's a number of different, especially mobile-focused WaterPoint data collection apps. We're indifferent, though. You can even write it on a piece of paper, put it in Excel, and share it, although we certainly recommend using one of the main apps.
Thank you. There is a question from Sarah. How willing were countries to contribute data?
This is an interesting one. So for a long time, I think countries were very happy to contribute data when there was no way to contribute data. Now that there's a real framework, we're starting to see a bit of a diversity within countries. Some countries are super willing. So countries that have shown real leadership in this area are places like Sierra Leone, Liberia, Swaziland, that have, even before WPDx, really worked hard to promote open data. Or in the case of Swaziland, leverage the capabilities of WPDx to open their data for the first time. So they don't have a standalone portal. The primary place you can access their national inventory is here. We're continuing to work with governments around the world to increase the openness of their data and working with donors and other partners to help show governments the value. It's certainly, there's a lot of kind of knee-jerk concerns, like what if people see that we have some broken water points and things like that. I'll say that of all of the data we've had added to WPDx to date, no one's ever asked to take any of it down. There's never been any issues with anything that's been shared. There's never been any negative publicity of, oh, this government is really doing a bad job. So I think a lot of the initial reactions and the initial hesitations haven't held up. And so we're seeing governments becoming more and more happy to share. I think the other piece of it is the fact that a lot of governments already have. So everyone's laundry is kind of equally dirty, and it's all out there. And what we're finding is there's a lot more we can learn from sharing data than we can, than the benefits of kind of hiding your data or not sharing it or not being transparent. So it certainly takes time to kind of build consensus and get everyone on board, but without a doubt, kind of the tide is certainly shifting towards a more open approach to sharing data, and that's how we've been able to achieve the data that we have in there right now.
Thank you. Another question from Lemlem. How can you ensure quality when the data is open to everyone?
Great question. And this is probably the most common question we get. So the way that we handle this is we're a platform for sharing the data that others collect. And one thing we do is we very transparently describe who gave us that data. And ultimately, it's up to the user, depending on their specific application, to determine whether that is of sufficient quality for their usage. So if you're just trying to get a sense of where there are water points in a country, maybe you can use any data. If you're carrying out a really high-level study, maybe you only want to use government data, and you'd prefer not to use NGO data, or maybe vice versa. And so we actually give you the ability to make that decision rather than making a decision of what's high-quality data, what's not. We provide a bunch of metadata. Why was the data originally collected? What was the goal of collection? How was it collected? Things like that to help you make that decision. But at the end of the day, it really depends on the use case to understand what threshold of data quality is required and what types of organizations provide that level of data. So we provide you all the tools you need so that you can make your decision. On our side, we're doing broad data validation. Is it in the right country? Did they fill the fields out correctly? Things like that. But it's really up to you to determine which data sources are most appropriate for your needs.
Right. Question from me. So I think you've covered that a little bit, but I would like a little more explanation. What do you do when several organization government will provide information for the same water point? Do you have a way to checking the accuracy of the data?
Sure. So when multiple different groups share data on the same water point, it's actually one of the best opportunities we have to learn, to see what's happening over time, because especially when you're looking at something like sustainability, a snapshot just doesn't capture it. So what's happening in the back end of our system is we have some algorithms set up. So if the water points are close to each other, about 10 meters, within 10 meters of each other or so, it'll trigger a process where it looks to see is something else in common. Is there a unique ID, maybe a physical unique identifier that matches? Or is it the same type of water point? Or was it installed by the same group or in the same year? And if any of that data lines up, then the system will assume them to be the same water point, and we'll add, what we call a WPDx ID. And so that WPDx ID will persist if another 100 different organizations all collect data over time on the same water point. All of that data will be connected through this WPDx ID, so we can actually learn over time and see the changes in status over time.
Perfect. Thank you. If there are any other questions, please ask them now, because we've answered all of them so far. We're going to give you another minute to write your questions down. I don't see anything. Anyway, if you Brian shared his email, so if there is any other questions you may have later, I think it's all right for you to join him, contact him directly. So I want to thank you.
Please.
Yeah, I want to thank you, Brian, for a great presentation. I hope you've all learned as much as I did. Enjoy the conference this week, Brian.
Thank you so much, and thanks for organizing this, and thanks to everyone who tuned in. And please do be in touch if you have ideas, if you have data, if you know about data. We'd love to hear from you. So thank you all so much.
Perfect. Thank you very much, and thank you everybody for participating. Bye.
Bye-bye.